The first thing I learned about monsters was that they do not always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they give orders. Sometimes they stand perfectly still while everyone around them trembles. And sometimes the monster is you. For 2 centuries, I have carried the weight of a body built for war and a bloodline I never asked to inherit. I learned early that fear was useful, weakness was dangerous, and attachment was a luxury that could get someone killed. So I kept my distance. I built walls. I became the man no one dared to challenge. And it worked. Until one quiet morning, I looked across my home and realized I had something I was terrified to lose. I had a family. And for the first time in 200 years, the thing that frightened me most was not death. It was what I might become to protect the people I loved. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of Niklaus and Sebastian's story. Part 2 is told through Niklaus's eyes as he faces the past, the beast within him, and everything he never expected to call his own. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Weight of the Iron. The smell of cold iron never leaves your skin once it has been pressed into your bone. In the dark, I can still hear the creak of the chains. I can feel the heavy dirt on my knees, cold and wet, stained with my own young blood. I remember my father's face as he stood outside the iron bars, not filled with hate but with cold, clinical disgust. "It's a monster," he had told the men in dark coats. "Take it before it slaughters us all." I was 7 years old. I didn't know what my crime was. I only knew that my chest burned, my fangs hurt, and the people who were supposed to love me had locked me in a box. 200 years later, I am supposed to be the most feared commander in the realm. Enemies drop their weapons when my aura hits the field. But right now, in the pitch-black silence of my own bedroom, the iron feels just as heavy. Niklaus snapped awake, his massive chest heaving against the silk sheets as his lungs clawed for air. His jaw was clenched so tight his molars groaned, his ancient hybrid blood throbbing a dangerous, warning crimson beneath his skin. He didn't move. He forced his broad frame to stay still, fighting down the violent impulse to tear the room apart. His fists gripped the bedsheets so hard the fabric shrieked under the pressure. Beside him the bed shifted. Sebastian didn't flinch, nor did he shrink away from the suffocating wave of heat radiating off his mate. The blood transfusion that had saved his life months ago had left him changed. His pale skin now carried a healthy, warm flush, his hazel eyes sharper, and his newly heightened senses easily picked up the quiet storm raging inside his mate. Sebastian sat up gracefully, his oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder. He reached out, sliding his slender, warm hand over Niklaus's rigid forearm, tracing the thick line of a dark tattoo down to his white-knuckled fist. "The chains aren't here, Niklaus," Sebastian whispered, his voice smooth, clear, and steady, a quiet anchor cutting clean through the dark fog. "You are in the master suite. The doors are open. You are home." Niklaus turned his head slowly. The glowing ruby in his eyes flickered, gradually dissolving back into deep, obsidian pupils as he took in the sight of his mate. Sebastian looked radiant in the dim moonlight, healthy, whole, and completely fearless in the presence of a creature that had terrified entire armies. Niklaus let out a long, shuddering exhale, turning his heavy palm upward to lock their fingers together. He looked at his beautiful mate and thought. He stood in front of death and didn't bow. He took my wild, deadly blood into his veins and made it quiet. He gave me a home when I thought I was only built for a graveyard. And yet, every time I look at him, every time I hear our son sleeping in the next room, a cold terror grips my throat. What if the beast behind my ribs snaps? What if I become the very thing my father was? "I woke you," Niklaus rasped, his voice low and gravelly, rough from the nightmare. He raised his free hand, gently tucking a stray lock of dark hair behind Sebastian's ear, his massive thumb tracing the warm curve of Sebastian's jaw with agonizing care. "I am sorry, little counselor." Sebastian cupped Niklaus's jaw, leaning in until their foreheads rested together. He looked straight into Niklaus's dark, obsidian eyes, his voice ringing with fierce, unshakable certainty. "I love you, Niklaus," Sebastian murmured, his breath warm against Niklaus's skin. "Leo and I are here to stay. We would never abandon you. Do you hear me? Never." Niklaus's breath hitched, the raw vulnerability in Sebastian's words striking deeper than any blade ever could. He closed his eyes for a split second, taking in a deep, greedy breath of Sebastian's calming scent before leaning up to capture his mate's lips in a slow, reverent kiss that sealed the promise between them. A small noise echoed from the doorway. A small head poked through the gap. Leo, looking healthy and bright-eyed, wearing flannel pajamas with little bears on them, dragged a wooden toy knight behind him. "Dad." Leo piped up, his small voice echoing in the quiet room. The sword fell off again. Can you fix it before breakfast? The transformation in Niklaus was instant. He swung his legs out of bed, scooped Leo effortlessly up into his broad arms, and cradled the boy against his chest like he weighed nothing at all. With a flick of his sharp thumbnail, Niklaus expertly pressed the wooden peg back into place. Fixed, little one, Niklaus rumbled gently, setting the toy back in Leo's hands. Now let's go get you fed. Downstairs, the grand kitchen of the estate was quiet and warm. Niklaus stood in a soft gray tunic by the stove, flipping golden pancakes in a cast-iron skillet. Next to him lay a plate of warm scrambled eggs and a tall glass of fresh milk carefully poured for a 6-year-old. Leo sat on a high wooden bar stool, kicking his feet contentedly as he watched his father work. Sebastian leaned against the doorframe, holding a fresh mug of tea, his heart brimming with quiet awe as he watched Niklaus slide a warm stack of pancakes in front of their son. Eat up, Leo, Niklaus said, ruffling the boy's hair with a massive, scarred hand before stepping back to pour Sebastian a cup of coffee. Out in the central training court, the morning sun broke through the mountain fog. The estate was humming with life. Gideon and Cassian were spar-fighting near the weapons rack, the sharp clack of wooden practice swords echoing off the stone walls. Julian sat on a stone bench reviewing boundary patrol maps. The protectors had changed over the last few months. The oppressive tension that used to choke the hallways was gone, replaced by a fierce, brotherhood-driven loyalty to the family their commander had built. Watch the footwork, Cassian. Gideon laughed, parrying a quick strike. You're moving like a sleepy bear. I'd like to see you move faster after Martha's heavy breakfast, Cassian shot back, wiping sweat from his brow. He stopped mid-swing as Sebastian walked into the courtyard, holding his tea with Leo trotting happily beside him. Every soldier in the yard immediately straightened up, nodding in genuine respect. Good morning, counselor, Gideon called out with a warm grin. Morning, little warrior. Morning, Uncle Gideon. Leo shouted, running over to show off his repaired wooden knight. Sebastian leaned against a stone pillar, taking a sip of his tea as he watched the guards interact with the boy. He felt a sudden, strange fluttering in his lower chest, a subtle, warm prickle in his senses that made him pause. He lowered his mug, his brows furrowing slightly as he pressed his hand over his stomach. That's strange, Sebastian thought, feeling a faint, pulsing thrum deep within his core, a pulse that didn't belong to his own heart nor Niklaus's. Before he could analyze the feeling, heavy footsteps echoed down the grand stone staircase. Niklaus stepped into the courtyard, dressed in his dark leather tactical coat, his imposing authority naturally settling over the space. Niklaus looked down at his family, at Leo running between the guards, and at Sebastian watching him with that quiet, unshakable devotion. He thought, the iron of my past is heavy, but looking at them now, I know one thing for certain. I will tear apart anything in this realm that tries to take this peace away from us. Chapter 2, Echoes of the Unseen. Peace is an unfamiliar uniform. For centuries, my mind was wired for blood, ambush, and tactical survival. Standing here in the courtyard watching Leo laugh as Cassian lifts him onto his shoulders, it feels fragile, like thin ice over a black lake. The beast beneath my skin is quiet today, lulled by the scent of Sebastian's warmth, but a part of me remains on guard. When you have spent a lifetime in chains, you always wait for the snap of the lock. I cannot remember the warmth of a mother's hug. I have no memories of siblings playing by my side. I only remember the cold iron bars, the dark serum forced into my veins, and the way the alchemist strove to sharpen my instincts until I was nothing more than a furious, unhinged weapon. Only Martha had ever dared to draw near my cage. Even when I was covered in blood and snarling at the iron bars, she was the only one who wiped my face, held my hand through the grates, and whispered the words that kept my soul alive. One day, little one, someone will see the man before the beast. I survived. I tore through those chains, escaped that hell, and built myself into a force no one in this realm could ever lock away again. But looking at my family now, the ghost of that caged boy still whispers in my ear. The morning sun rose higher over the compound, casting long golden shadows across the stone courtyard. Sebastian stood near the archway, his hand resting absently over his lower abdomen. The strange, subtle pulse he had felt earlier hadn't returned, but a quiet, persistent warmth lingered beneath his skin. Ever since the blood transfusion, his senses had been sharper. He could hear the distant rustle of pine needles in the mountain breeze, feel the subtle shifts in temperature before a fog rolled in, and read Niklaus's emotional state like an open page. You're quiet today, little counselor, Niklaus rumbled as he stepped up behind Sebastian. Niklaus didn't care that his top lieutenants were just a few yards away. He wrapped a heavy, protective arm around Sebastian's waist, pulling his mate back against his broad chest. He rested his chin lightly on Sebastian's shoulder, his deep voice vibrating right against Sebastian's ear. Sebastian leaned back into the solid wall of Niklaus's chest, closing his eyes for a second as he let out a soft sigh. "I'm just thinking," Sebastian replied gently, covering Niklaus's large, scarred hand with his own. "About how much this place has changed. About how much we have changed. Is that a bad thing?" Niklaus asked, his tone dropping into a low, serious register. "No," Sebastian said, turning his head to look Niklaus in the eyes. "It's wonderful. But your blood in my veins? It feels different today, Niklaus. Active. It's hard to explain." Dr. Valeria emerged from the side wing, stepping into the courtyard with her medical ledger. "Good morning, Commander. Sebastian, if you have a quick moment, I'd like to take your routine blood draw for the monthly panel before you leave for your office." "Of course, Valeria," Sebastian smiled. They stepped into the compound's infirmary for just a few minutes. Sebastian sat calmly as Valeria drew a small vial of blood, while Niklaus stood nearby, his protective gaze fixed on Sebastian. Once the draw was complete, Sebastian retrieved his coat and keys, preparing to drive to his counseling practice at the sanctuary. He gave Niklaus a warm squeeze on the hand. "I'm heading to my office at the sanctuary to see a few clients before lunch," Sebastian said softly, pressing a quick kiss to Niklaus's cheek. "I'll see you in a bit." I have watched him drive out through the heavy iron gates countless times, heading toward the sanctuary, the very place he was taken from us months ago. Every single time the same instinct rises in me. I want to follow him. I want to stand guard outside his door, to make certain nothing touches him while he is away. But every time I force myself to stay back and let him have his independence. But less than an hour later, a violent spike of distress tears through our mate bond like a bolt of lightning. My heart slams against my ribs a split second before my comms device blares. Out at the sanctuary, Sebastian had barely unlocked his office door when a dizzying wave of intense heat rushed through his body. The room spun wildly. The keys clattered against the floorboards, and his knees completely buckled beneath him. He collapsed onto the rug, gasping for air as his core surged with an overwhelming ancient energy. His assistant in the lobby heard the heavy thud, rushed in, and immediately dialed the commander's private line on speaker. "Commander. It's Sebastian. He just collapsed in his office." Niklaus didn't even reply. Within seconds, the black SUV tore out of the compound gates, tires screaming against the asphalt as Niklaus drove like a demon possessed. He covered a 20-minute drive in less than 6, striding into the sanctuary like a storm. He burst through the office doors, his eyes blazing a frantic, terrifying crimson as he dropped to his knees and scooped his pale, trembling mate into his massive arms. "Sebastian." Niklaus roared, his voice thick with sheer panic. I'm okay," Sebastian wheezed, clutching Niklaus's tunic, though his skin was burning hot. "Just dizzy, my core." Without waiting another second, Niklaus carried Sebastian straight back out to the vehicle, driving at breakneck speed back to the compound and rushing him directly into Dr. Valeria's infirmary. Valeria immediately placed a diagnostic scanner over Sebastian's abdomen, cross-referencing the reading with the newly drawn blood panel under her magnifying lens. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the rapid beep of the medical monitor. Valeria's eyes widened to the size of saucers as she stared at the scan. A human body carrying an Enigma vampire's biological offspring should be impossible, Valeria said, her voice breathless with disbelief. But your transfusion changed Sebastian's physiology enough for his body to accept your bloodline. Commander. She turned the screen toward them. 2 distinct golden pulses flickered side by side. Sebastian is carrying 2 children. Twins. My world stops. The sound of the monitors, the wind outside, even the beating of my own heart vanishes. My hybrid blood. My twins. A miracle, or a curse nestled inside my mate? A sudden, terrifying flash hits my mind. The iron cell, the cold floor, the dark serum the alchemist forced into my veins, and my father's disgusted eyes as he locked me away. A beast like me, reproducing? Creating 2 children who could inherit this wild, dangerous blood? My jaw clenches, my hands trembling violently as panic, self-loathing, and fierce, agonizing protectiveness wage war inside my soul. Sebastian saw the sudden paleness in Niklaus's face, the wild terror and pain warring behind those dark ruby-flecked eyes. Sebastian turned his head toward the doctor. Valeria, please give us the room. Valeria nodded respectfully, stepping out quietly and closing the heavy doors behind her. The moment the latch clicked, Sebastian sat up on the exam table. He reached out with his heightened senses, intentionally releasing a thick, sweet wave of his soothing, calming omega pheromones into the air. The warm, comforting scent flooded the sterile infirmary, wrapping around Niklaus like a soft blanket. Niklaus took a ragged breath, the scent immediately cutting through the edge of his panic. Sebastian reached up with both hands, cupping Niklaus's rough, massive jaw and turning his face gently toward him. "Look at me, Niklaus," Sebastian murmured, his voice ringing with fierce, unshakable devotion. "Look at me." Niklaus's glowing eyes locked onto Sebastian's hazel ones, his broad chest heaving. "You are not the alchemist's monster," Sebastian whispered, his thumbs gently stroking the high curve of Niklaus's cheekbones. "You are not your father. Martha was right all those years ago. There is a man here, a good man, a loving father who makes pancakes for our son and protects this home. You broke those chains a long time ago, Niklaus. These babies aren't a curse. They are a miracle, a blend of your strength and my humanity. And we are going to raise them together, in the light, surrounded by love." Niklaus's breath hitched. A single heavy tear escaped his dark eyes, tracing down his scarred cheek before he buried his face into the crook of Sebastian's neck, his massive arms wrapping around his mate with a desperate, reverent hold that shook his entire frame. As I hold him close, the dark noise in my mind finally goes quiet. The beast beneath my skin settles, calmed by Sebastian's warmth and the steady rhythm of the two tiny heartbeats growing inside him. For the first time in my life, there is no urge to fight or destroy, only a deep, quiet satisfaction, and an absolute resolve to protect the family we've built. Chapter 3, Bound by Blood and Shadows. Walking out of the infirmary feels like stepping into a completely different world. My hand rests flat against the small of Sebastian's back, my palm broad enough to cover almost his entire spine. Every nerve ending in my body is on high alert. The air around us smells richer, thick with the scent of pine, rain, and the faint, unmistakable golden pulse of two new lives anchoring themselves into our reality. I spent 2 centuries believing my legacy would be nothing more than blood spilled in dark corridors. Now, I must figure out how to tell a 6-year-old boy that he's going to be an older brother to twins. They found Leo in the main living quarters, sprawling across the oversized leather sofa with a sketchpad in his lap. Cashin was sitting in the armchair nearby, patiently sharpening a set of training daggers while keeping a watchful eye on the boy. "Hey, kiddo," Sebastian called softly, stepping into the warm light of the hearth. Leo looked up, his face instantly lighting up as he tossed his colored pencils aside. "Dad, Cashin said we might practice archery at the range later, but..." He stopped mid-sentence, his bright eyes darting between them. His brow furrowed as his sharp young senses picked up the lingering thick sweetness of Sebastian's pheromones and the intense, protective aura radiating off Niklaus. "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" Niklaus stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long, comforting shadow over the couch. He dropped to one knee in front of Leo, bringing himself down to eye level with the 6-year-old. "Nothing bad, little warrior," Niklaus said, his deep voice carrying a rare, soft warmth. "In fact, something very special." Sebastian sat beside Leo on the cushion, taking the boy's small hand in his own. "Do you remember how we talked about how families grow, Leo? How much love there is in this home for you?" Leo nodded slowly, his wide eyes shifting to Sebastian's stomach, then back up to his face. Are you sick?" "No," Sebastian smiled softly, a brilliant, tearful warmth shining in his hazel eyes. "I'm carrying Leo. You're going to be a big brother." Leo's jaw dropped. "A big brother?" A huge, breathless grin broke across his face, but before he could even cheer, Sebastian leaned in closer with a gentle laugh. "And Valeria just checked," Sebastian added softly. "There are 2 heartbeats. You're going to have twin siblings." Leo gasped, jumping straight off the sofa with an ecstatic shout. "Twins? 2 of them?" He threw his arms around Sebastian's neck, hugging him tightly before turning and hurling himself into Niklaus's chest. Niklaus caught the boy effortlessly, wrapping his massive arm around him and pressing a firm, protective kiss to the top of Leo's head. Over by the fireplace, Cashin stopped sharpening his blade. A rare, genuine smile broke across the commander's lieutenant's face as he leaned back. "Twins, boss? Looks like you're going to need double the perimeter guards." "We're going to need more than that," Niklaus murmured, his eyes darkening with sudden, sharp resolve as he set Leo back on his feet. "Cashin, call Gideon. Gather the protectors in the war room immediately. The joy in my home is a fragile, precious flame. And in this realm, anything precious draws predators. The news of a human-vampire hybrid, let alone twins born of an ancient Enigma line, will not remain a secret forever. Whispers travel through the shadows like wildfire. Rogue factions, old enemies, and those who seek to harvest legendary bloodlines will eventually come looking. But they will find only death at these gates. 10 minutes later, the heavy iron doors of the compound's war room swung shut. Gideon, the head of intelligence, stood at the head of the oak tactical table alongside Cassian, Darian and 4 senior commanders of the Protector Squad. Maps of the surrounding mountain passes and sanctuary routes were laid out under tactical lights. Niklaus stood at the head of the room, arms crossed over his broad chest, his presence commanding absolute silence. "You all know the status of our borders," Niklaus began, his voice echoing off the stone walls like low thunder. "As of today, security protocols for this compound and the sanctuary line are elevated to maximum threat tier. No one enters or leaves without direct clearance from me or Cassian." Gideon narrowed his eyes, adjusting his glasses as he read the room. "Commander, is there a specific threat we are anticipating?" "An operational leak. We are protecting a miracle," Niklaus said plainly, his red-flecked eyes sweeping across every loyal soldier in the room. "Sebastian is bearing my heirs. Twins." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the protectors. Gideon's jaw tightened, realizing instantly the astronomical weight of what Niklaus was saying. "Understood," Gideon said, his voice turning to steel. "If the Council or the Outer Clans get wind of a pure Enigma hybrid line, they'll view them as either the ultimate weapons or a threat to their power. I'll double the covert scouts along the perimeter ridges immediately. Set up secondary checkpoints along the drive to the sanctuary," Niklaus ordered, slamming his heavy palm onto the center of the map. "And assign a full escort squad to Sebastian whenever he steps outside these walls. If so much as a stray wolf smells his trail, I want them put down before they reach the tree line." "Consider it done, Commander," Cassian grunted, gripping his sword hilt with a dark grin. "Darian," Niklaus said, turning toward the senior commander, "I want you to oversee the eastern defensive grid. Audit every secondary ward, rotate the sentries and personally verify the emergency access points around the master wing." Darian straightened immediately. "Understood, Commander." "No one changes a ward rotation without your authorization," Niklaus continued. "You report directly to me. Consider it done." Niklaus gave a brief nod before turning back to the map. Darian's expression remained perfectly composed. "I won't let anything through." As the officers began collecting their maps to head out to their posts, Gideon stepped over to where Sebastian was standing near the doorway. He stopped, offering a rare gentle bow of his head. "Congratulations, Sebastian," Gideon said softly, a look of profound respect in his sharp eyes. "Before you walked through these gates, this place was just a fortress full of soldiers waiting for the next war. You made us a family. We'll guard those little ones with our lives." Cassian walked up behind him, clapping a heavy hand on Sebastian's shoulder with a warm smirk. "Thanks, little counselor. You gave the big guy a heart and you gave the rest of us something worth fighting for. Rest up, we've got the perimeter." Sebastian smiled through a veil of happy tears, watching them stride out to fortify the compound. Chapter 4, The Price of Miracles. Power has always been mine to command. I have spent centuries knowing what it means to wield more strength than the people around me could ever hope to withstand. I know what power demands. I know the price it can exact. But I never imagined it would demand him. Every day for the past 8 weeks, I have watched the man who anchored my soul fade before my eyes. This pregnancy is draining his stamina, his strength, his blood. To hold him in my arms now is to feel glass, so delicate that one wrong breath from the beast inside me might shatter him completely. Panic is a constant, suffocating shadow. The twin hybrid pregnancy was not a gentle gift, it was a storm. Within weeks, the strain on Sebastian's human biology grew terrifyingly severe. Morning sickness was a cruel misnomer, it raged continuously, leaving him unable to keep down solid food for days at a time. The brilliant color in his cheeks vanished, replaced by a frail, translucent pale. By the 6th week, the drastic weight loss left his ribcage visible against his skin, and his muscle strength had depleted so thoroughly that his legs could no longer support his weight. Walking across the room became an impossibility. "Hold on to me, love," Niklaus murmured one morning, his voice raw with suppressed fear as he lifted Sebastian effortlessly out of bed. Sebastian's head slumped weakly against Niklaus's chest, his breathing shallow, fingers barely able to clutch the commander's collar. "I'm sorry," Sebastian whispered, his hazel eyes clouded with exhaustion. "I'm trying. Niklaus." "Don't you dare apologize," Niklaus rasped, pressing his forehead against Sebastian's burning skin. "You are carrying two worlds inside you. Rest." In the infirmary, Dr. Valeria adjusted the foreline with solemn hands. The twins were developing at an extraordinary rate, placing demands on Sebastian's human body that it simply could not meet on its own. "His body is being depleted by the pregnancy," Valeria explained quietly to Niklaus while Sebastian slept. "He's struggling to produce enough blood and energy to support both babies. Without a constant source of Enigma blood, his organs will eventually begin to fail. We need to continue weekly direct blood transfusions and maintain his nutritional and physical support around the clock. Without a constant source of Enigma blood, his organs will fail. We need to begin weekly direct blood transfusions, combined with uninterrupted scent marking and heavy pheromone nesting every single night." Every 7 days, Niklaus sat beside the infirmary bed, his jaw set in rigid focus as Valeria ran a tube from his own vein directly into Sebastian's. Niklaus would gather Sebastian against his chest, releasing thick, soothing alpha pheromones into the room until the air was heavy with the scent of cedar and rain. As his dark Enigma blood flowed into Sebastian's body, the faint warmth beneath Sebastian's skin would gradually settle, his body responding to the familiar blood and scent of his mate. Only then would Sebastian find relief, sleeping for hours wrapped in Niklaus's arms, guarded round the clock by a frantic, fiercely protective commander who barely left his side. The days between treatments were often long and exhausting, but Niklaus refused to let the infirmary become the only world Sebastian knew. One quiet afternoon, after Sebastian had finally managed to keep down a small bowl of broth, Niklaus carried him to the wide window seat in their bedroom and settled him carefully beneath a mountain of blankets. Leo sat nearby on the carpet, surrounded by colored pencils and sheets of paper. "What are you drawing?" Sebastian asked softly. Leo held up the page with a proud smile. "Our family." Niklaus glanced over. There were 4 figures on the paper. A very large, dark figure stood in the middle with Sebastian and Leo beside him. 2 tiny golden figures had been drawn between them. Sebastian's eyes softened. Leo pointed at the 2 little figures. "Those are the babies." Niklaus went completely still. Leo looked up at him. "Are they really in there?" His small finger pointed toward Sebastian's stomach. "They are," Sebastian answered gently. Leo crawled closer to the bed, his expression suddenly serious. "Can they hear us?" Niklaus looked at Sebastian before answering. Then he slowly knelt beside Leo. "Perhaps," Niklaus said quietly. "So you should tell them something important." Leo thought about it for a long moment. Then he leaned closer. "Hi," he whispered toward Sebastian's stomach. "I'm Leo. I'm your big brother. You can have my old toys, but not my wooden knight." Sebastian laughed softly, the sound weak but genuine. Niklaus's mouth twitched. Leo frowned at him. "What?" "Nothing," Niklaus murmured. "That seems like a fair condition." After a moment, Leo placed his small hand carefully over Sebastian's. "You have to get better," he said quietly. The laughter disappeared from the room. Sebastian looked down at him. Leo's voice grew smaller. "Because you promised we would all live here together." Niklaus's chest tightened. Before Sebastian could answer, Niklaus reached over and covered Leo's hand with his own enormous one, keeping both of their hands gently against Sebastian. "We will," Niklaus said. His voice was low but absolute. "We are going to do everything we can." Leo nodded, apparently satisfied. Then he climbed onto the edge of the bed and leaned carefully against Niklaus's side. For several quiet minutes, none of them spoke. Sebastian rested beneath the blankets, exhausted but warm. Leo sat tucked against Niklaus's arm. And Niklaus remained between them, one hand resting over his mate and the other around the child he had once rescued. For the first time in days, the commander allowed himself to close his eyes. His family was here. For this moment they were safe. 2 months passed in this tense, fragile rhythm. Through sheer devotion, weekly transfusions, and the relentless care of both Niklaus and Martha, Sebastian's condition finally stabilized enough for him to sit up in bed, color slowly returning to his lips as the twins settled into a steady, healthy growth phase. Then the peace was shattered. It was late afternoon when the alarms at the outer perimeter gate chimed, not a breach alarm, but a delivery ping at the secondary security checkpoint. Cashin stepped into the master quarters, his expression grim, holding a heavy wooden box wrapped in dark iron bands. "Perimeter scouts found this at the south gate," Cashin said quietly, his hand resting on his sword hilt. "No courier in sight." It was left directly on the boundary stone. Niklaus gently placed a blanket over the sleeping Sebastian, stepping out into the hallway and shutting the door soundlessly behind him. Gideon joined them in the corridor, his eyes sharp behind his glasses as Cashin set the box on a side table. "It's been treated with an alchemical masking compound," Gideon noted, examining the iron bands. "Something designed to suppress the scent of whatever is inside." Niklaus didn't wait. With a flick of his clawed hand, he snapped the iron lock and flipped the lid open. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a glass vial filled with a dark iridescent serum, the exact same serum that had been forced through Niklaus's veins in his youth, alongside a rusty piece of iron chain. Soaked into the velvet beneath it was the distinct, sickening smell of sulfur, dried blood, and copper. Pinned to the inner lid was a parchment note written in dark, meticulous ink. "My finest creation has proven fertile. The serum lives in your veins and now it grows inside a human vessel. Deliver the counselor and the unborn specimens to my laboratory, Niklaus, or I will come and carve them out of him myself." Silence fell over the corridor, cold and suffocating as tomb air. "The Alchemist," Gideon said, his face going pale. "We thought you killed everyone in that laboratory when you escaped." "Apparently he survived," Niklaus whispered, his voice dangerously low, vibrating with a dark ancient terror that instantly turned into lethal fury. The ghost of the caged boy vanished, replaced entirely by a predatory monster defending his mate and offspring. Niklaus looked down at the rusty iron chain, his crimson eyes glowing with absolute wrath. "He thinks I am still his weapon," Niklaus growled, the stone beneath his boots cracking under the force of his anger. "Gather the protectors. We are going to hunt him down before he ever sets foot near my family." Chapter 5. Blood on the Horizon. For 200 years, the smell of sulfur and dark copper has followed me into my nightmares. It is the smell of the iron cage. The smell of needles piercing my skin. The smell of the man who watched me bleed and called my suffering progress. I killed him once. I watched his blood run across those stones. I heard his final breath. I believed that was the end. But monsters like the Alchemist do not die quietly. They crawl back from the darkness, carrying the same hunger that destroyed everything they touched. And now he has spoken my mate's name. He has looked at Sebastian and seen a vessel. He has looked at my children and seen specimens. My children. Something inside me goes still whenever I think about that. He took my childhood. He took my blood. He spent years trying to turn me into a weapon. But he will not take my family. He created the monster. He taught me how to survive. And now he is going to learn exactly what that monster became. He forgot one thing. A weapon may belong to the hand that forged it. But a father belongs to no one. The war room was suffocatingly quiet. The dark vial of serum and the rusted iron chain sat at the center of the oak tactical table beneath the stark overhead lamps. Surrounding it were Gideon, Cashin, Darian, and the 6 senior captains of the Protector Guard. Their faces were carved of stone, their eyes fixed on the man standing at the head of the table. Niklaus hadn't moved in 10 minutes. His massive hands rested flat against the wood, the veins along his forearms dark and pronounced with the strain of his Enigma physiology. The temperature in the room seemed to drop beneath the weight of his anger, and a brittle silence settled over the gathered commanders. "Gideon," Niklaus commanded, his voice barely a whisper, yet carrying enough suppressed force to make the glasses on the table tremble. "Track the signature on that seal." Gideon leaned over his terminal, his fingers moving rapidly as the diagnostic system scanned the box. "The sealing compound contains a degraded blood alchemy formula," Gideon said. "It's unstable, but I can isolate the biological signature. He's operating out of a temporary sanctuary, likely the abandoned iron mines in the Black Ridge Mountains 30 miles north. It's the only site in the sector rich enough in copper and iron to conceal the equipment and suppress the laboratory's scent." "He isn't acting alone," Cashin grunted, his hand tightening around the hilt of his broadsword until his knuckles turned white. "A ghost like the Alchemist doesn't resurface without an army. He's hired mercenaries, outer clan outcasts, rogue enigmas who want a piece of hybrid blood. Let them come," Niklaus growled, his ruby-flecked eyes burning with a terrifying crimson intensity. "They will find only an open grave." "Commander," Gideon interrupted, his tone careful but firm. "You cannot simply ride out and leave the compound exposed. If this is a feint, if he sent the package to draw you away while his people attack the sanctuary or this fortress, Sebastian will be vulnerable." The mention of Sebastian's name acted like a leash on the beast raging beneath Niklaus's ribs. Niklaus closed his eyes and drew a ragged, heavy breath. "Cashin," Niklaus ordered, turning toward his lieutenant. Take 50 protectors and seal every pass between here and Black Ridge. No one gets within 10 miles of this valley. Cassian gave a sharp nod. Gideon reinforced the security barriers around the main estate. I want a perimeter so tight a shadow couldn't slip through. Understood. And you, Commander? Cassian asked. I stay here, Niklaus said, his jaw clenching. Next to my mate. For a moment no one spoke. Darian remained perfectly still among the other commanders, his expression controlled and unreadable as he listened to every order. Then the officers began gathering their maps and preparing to move. Niklaus watched them leave one by one, unaware that the man standing among his most trusted commanders had already begun preparing the way for the enemy. Upstairs in the master quarters, the heavy oak door creaked open. Sebastian was sitting up in the broad velvet-draped bed, propped up against a stack of pillows. Though still pale and slender from the brutal toll of the twin pregnancy, the weekly blood transfusions and Niklaus's constant pheromones had brought a healthy, soft flush back to his cheeks. His hand rested protectively over his stomach, where the faint golden glow beneath his skin was quiet and steady. He didn't need to ask what had happened downstairs. The thick, acrid scent of distress and violent rage rolling off Niklaus in waves told him everything. Niklaus, Sebastian called softly, holding out a hand. The towering warrior instantly crossed the room, dropping to his knees beside the bed. Niklaus buried his face into Sebastian's lap, wrapping his massive arms around his mate's waist with a desperate, crushing intensity. His broad shoulders trembled. Sebastian didn't flinch. He gently ran his fingers through Niklaus's thick, dark hair, massaging his scalp and threading his fingers along the base of the commander's neck, intentionally releasing a soft, sweet stream of calming omega pheromones. I heard the alarm, Sebastian whispered gently. I felt your terror through the bond. What happened? Niklaus stayed silent for a long moment, his chest heaving against Sebastian's thigh. A ghost? Niklaus rasped, his voice raw with a pain he had buried for 2 centuries. The man who put me in the iron cage. He knows about you, Sebastian. He knows about the twins. Sebastian's breath caught in his throat, fear striking deep into his chest. But as he looked down at the top of Niklaus's dark head, at the mighty Enigma who had torn through chains, built a home and held him through every midnight fever, the fear slowly hardened into unshakable resolve. Look at me, Niklaus, Sebastian murmured. Niklaus lifted his head, his crimson eyes wide, haunted by the memories of his childhood. Sebastian reached down, cupping Niklaus's rough, scarred face in both hands. He leaned forward until their foreheads rested together, their breaths mingling between them. He thinks you are still that terrified boy in the cell, Sebastian said, his hazel eyes flashing with fierce, protective fire. He thinks he owns you. But he doesn't know what you have become. He doesn't know that you have a family now and that we are not weak. You freed yourself once, Niklaus. And together, we will burn his legacy to ashes so our children never have to hear his name. Niklaus stared at his mate as the wild panic in his chest slowly crystallized into something colder, lethal, precise, and absolute. He leaned up and pressed a fierce, reverent kiss to Sebastian's lips. Then his broad palm settled protectively over Sebastian's abdomen, feeling the distinct, rhythmic movement of the 2 lives growing inside him. He will never reach this room, Niklaus swore softly against Sebastian's skin. I will tear down the mountains before I let him lay a finger on you. Chapter 6. The Monster Within. I believed protecting someone meant standing between them and the blade. No one tells you what to do when the danger is inside the person you love. I can fight armies, tear through stone, and track an enemy through a mountain storm, but I cannot fight the 2 tiny sparks growing inside Sebastian without hurting the miracle they are becoming. After the Alchemist's threat, the estate changed entirely. No one dared say the word fear, yet it lived in every corridor. The protectors doubled their patrols, Gideon spent long hours tracing alchemical signatures across the mountain ranges, and Cassian rode out with scouting teams toward Black Ridge, where the first trail appeared to lead. Upstairs, Martha took firm control of the household. Niklaus had spent the first 2 days trailing Sebastian from room to room until Martha finally planted herself directly between them. When she pointed out that staring at the poor boy would only make him recover simply to escape him, Sebastian laughed weakly from his pile of pillows. Niklaus scowled, insisting he was merely monitoring his condition, but Martha and Sebastian both accused him of looming. Looking thoroughly betrayed by both of them, Niklaus could only watch as Martha set down a tray of warm broth, soft bread, sliced fruit, and a small cup of tea, demanding Sebastian eat 3 more bites. Though Sebastian dramatically complained that he was carrying twins rather than joining the army, Martha stood her ground, noting that soldiers complained far less about breakfast. Leo burst into laughter from his chair beside the bed, while Niklaus failed to suppress a smile. Resigned to his fate, Sebastian took his 3 bites one by one, declaring he had no allies in the house. Martha immediately whisked the plate away, declaring victory to Niklaus's disbelief. Later that morning, Leo sat cross-legged on the rug beside Sebastian's bed, carefully drawing in his sketchpad. When Sebastian softly asked what he was making, Leo held the page against his chest and announced that it was their family, though it was not finished yet. Niklaus glanced down from his place beside the bed to ask why, and Leo pointed toward Sebastian's stomach, explaining that he had to make room for 2. The room went quiet as Martha paused near the window. Tapping his chin with a charcoal pencil, Leo declared with fierce concentration that Grandma Martha had to be in the picture too, causing Martha to freeze in place. As Sebastian looked toward her with gentle warmth in his eyes, Leo chattered on, adding Uncle Cassian and Uncle Gideon to the drawing. Niklaus looked down at the wild, jagged lines of people holding hands and noted that it was a very large family, to which Leo solemnly replied that he had a big paper. Martha turned back to the tea kettle before anyone could see the sudden moisture in her eyes. Niklaus watched her quietly, recognizing that the woman who had once reached through cold iron bars to comfort a terrified captive boy was now woven into the heart of his home. His gaze moved from Martha to Sebastian, then down to the drawing, and for the first time in days, he felt the brutal tension in his shoulders finally ease. Outside that room, however, the shadows were moving. Cassian's patrol reached Black Ridge and encountered mercenaries guarding an abandoned mining route, an attack fierce enough to confirm someone wanted them looking there. Back at the estate, Gideon studied the reports and warned Niklaus later that evening that the signal was far too obvious to be anything other than a decoy. At that same hour, Darian stood alone in an unused eastern corridor. As a senior commander of the Protectors who had fought beside Cassian for 10 years, he was a man no one suspected. He pressed his palm against an old section of stone, and the alchemical tracking compound beneath the skin of his wrist warmed as it activated. A faint signal pulsed through the receiver concealed beneath his sleeve. "The twins are confirmed," Darian said. A heavy, suffocating pause followed before the cold, satisfied voice returned through the receiver. "Black Ridge has served its purpose. Let Niklaus waste his soldiers searching empty tunnels." Darian's expression remained unreadable in the dim light. "And the estate?" The answer came like a blade through the darkness. "Prepare the way." Chapter 7, The Man Inside the Walls. Martha became Sebastian's constant companion during the long, exhausting weeks that followed. She made it her personal mission to oversee his care directly, bringing his meals herself, helping him adjust his pillows whenever his strength faltered, and firmly enforcing a sanctuary of quiet around him. Her most frequent duty, however, proved to be ushering Niklaus out of the bedroom whenever the commander allowed his paranoia to bleed into his work. When Niklaus spread a series of detailed tactical maps across the foot of the bed, Martha didn't hesitate to snatch them up and banish war maps from the presence of a pregnant man. Niklaus looked up with a flat, incredulous expression, uttering her name in warning, but Martha remained unwavering, pointing out that he owned an entire fortress and could easily work elsewhere. From his nest of blankets, Sebastian hid a subtle smile that Niklaus caught instantly, accusing his mate of enjoying the spectacle. Sebastian simply closed his eyes and admitted that he was enjoying it very much. The physical strain on Sebastian only grew heavier as the weeks wore on, testing his emotional endurance to its limits. One afternoon, after a grueling bout of sickness left him unable to keep even broth down, exhaustion finally replaced his quiet patience. Staring up at the canopy with tears prickling in his eyes, he whispered how much he hated feeling so utterly helpless. Martha pulled a wooden chair to the bedside, taking his trembling hand into her warm, lined palms and softly confessing how much she hated seeing him suffer. She asked if he truly believed Niklaus enjoyed being confronted with helplessness again, reminding him that Niklaus had spent 2 centuries believing relying on anyone was a weakness until Sebastian came along to teach him how to trust. Brushing a stray lock of hair from Sebastian's damp forehead, Martha insisted it was now her turn to teach him the exact same lesson, looking deep into his eyes to reassure him that needing care did not make him useless. His tears finally spilled over, and he squeezed her hand in silent, overwhelming gratitude. While a fragile peace remained within the sick room, a silent poison was spreading through the rest of the fortress. In the war room, Gideon uncovered a terrifying pattern within the estate's security logs, realizing an intelligence breach was actively undercutting their defenses. Someone inside the walls possessed exact knowledge of patrol rotations, defensive barriers, and the precise layout of the master wing where Sebastian slept. Cassion's blood ran cold at the revelation, prompting him to launch a silent, high-priority investigation into the guard, determined to tear the traitor out himself. Yet the insider moved faster than their countermeasures could adapt. Late that evening, an abrupt surge rippled through the fortress security grid, followed by the release of a faint, metallic-smelling compound through the eastern ventilation system. One by one, the secondary defensive systems shut down, while several nearby protectors suddenly staggered, their strength draining as the compound interfered with their vampire physiology. Cassion froze in the middle of the courtyard. He recognized the symptoms immediately: weakness, slowed reflexes, dulled senses. This was not an ordinary attack. Someone had used a suppressant designed specifically to weaken vampires. He sprinted toward the primary security control room at the inner gate. When he burst through the arched doorway, he found a solitary figure standing over the shattered control mechanism. Darian turned slowly, his face illuminated only by the dying sparks of the disabled security systems. For several agonizing seconds, neither man moved as Cassion's expression transformed from shock into a gut-wrenching sense of betrayal. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword until his knuckles turned white, drawing his blade as Darian offered only a sorrowful, muted apology. Cassion spat out Darian's name and cut off his plea, warning him never to call him brother again and declaring that the commander would never forgive what he had done. Darian offered only a hollow, broken smile, asking what there was to forgive other than his own survival. Before Cassion could lunge forward, Darian pulled the heavy stone lever, and with a deafening grind of iron and ancient gears, the inner gate began to swing open to the night. Chapter 8, The Breach. The estate erupted into a frenzy of blaring sirens and echoing iron bells. Niklaus sensed the collapse of the ancient wards through his very blood before the first intruder had even crossed the eastern boundary. In a flicker of shadow and motion, he was beside Sebastian's bed, his massive frame radiating lethal tension. He placed a hand over Sebastian's shoulder, his voice low and commanding as he ordered him to stay put. Sebastian's heart hammered against his ribs in sheer panic, his fingers wrapping desperately around Niklaus's wrist as he tried to speak, but Niklaus simply covered Sebastian's hand with his own and assured him that Martha was already on her way. As if summoned by his words, Martha burst through the heavy oak doors moments later, taking in the scene with one sharp, calculating glance. Niklaus turned toward Leo and ordered Martha to take him to safety, but Martha met his gaze without flinching and demanded to know what was to become of Sebastian. The agonizing conflict in Niklaus's eyes lasted only a second, but Martha saw it clearly, her expression hardening with maternal fury as she reminded him that she had raised him from a boy and asked if he truly believed she would leave his mate unprotected while armed men breached this home. Niklaus went silent, paralyzed by her devotion, until Martha stepped closer and firmly told him to clear the hallway, declaring that she had her family covered. For one breathless moment, Niklaus stared at her, recognizing the same unbreakable strength that had once reached through iron bars to comfort a frightened child, before he nodded sharply and vanished into the shadows. Martha moved with immediate, practiced efficiency, ordering Leo to get behind her as the young boy scrambled off the bed and obeyed without question. Sebastian gritted his teeth and tried to force himself upright, but a sharp wave of agony tore through his abdomen, forcing him to double over with a gasping sob. Martha caught him before he could fall, gently telling him not to be stubborn, to which Sebastian weakly called her name, only for Martha to reply that he could help by simply staying conscious. Despite the chaotic threat lingering in the air, Sebastian almost laughed. Martha carefully guided him toward the reinforced alcove of the inner room while steel rang against steel somewhere beyond the walls and violent impacts shook the ancient foundations. Sebastian instinctively curled around his stomach, one hand protectively covering the twins while his other arm stretched behind him, keeping Leo pinned safely close to his side. Outside the bedroom, Niklaus collided with the first wave of armed infiltrators in a display of devastating violence. The commander no longer bothered to restrain the feral strength beneath his skin. Centuries of controlled fury surged through every muscle, sharpening his speed, his reflexes, and his lethal precision. But this time his rage was not wild or directionless. It had a purpose. He was a shield. The intruders had come for his home, for Sebastian, and for Leo, and Niklaus made certain they would not cross another threshold. Further down the corridor, Darian had managed to break away after his brutal clash with Cassion. Cassion pursued him through the smoke-filled hallways, wounded and exhausted, but still gripping his blade tightly as he refused to let the traitor escape. Darien reached the master wing just as the final eastern security barrier failed. He stepped through the opening with his blade drawn, then stopped. Martha stood in the center of the room, both hands wrapped around a heavy iron fire poker. Behind her, Leo pressed himself against the stone wall, clutching his little wooden knight against his chest. Sebastian sat on the floor, pale and shaking, one hand protectively covering his abdomen. Darien gave a faint, bitter smile. The old guard takes a long time to disappear. Martha's eyes turned cold. I have been listening to empty threats from arrogant young men for over 200 years. Darien raised his blade and struck the reinforced barrier protecting the room. Martha immediately shoved Leo farther behind her, placing her own body between the traitor and the child. Then Sebastian felt something change inside him. A sudden surge of heat rushed through his veins. His breathing quickened as his hand pressed protectively against his abdomen. His Omega pheromones erupted into the room, far stronger than before, almost as overwhelming as Niklaus's own presence. The air seemed to thicken beneath the sheer intensity of his scent, and Darien froze as the unexpected force of Sebastian's pheromones washed over him. Sebastian could barely hear the fighting outside anymore. His entire body narrowed around one instinct: protect them. His children. Leo. His family. No one was taking them. No one was touching Leo. Gathering every remaining ounce of strength his exhausted body could produce, Sebastian released the force building inside him in a violent defensive surge. The impact struck Darien squarely and hurled him backward into the corridor. But the effort emptied Sebastian completely. His pheromones abruptly faltered, his strength disappearing with them. His vision blurred, his body went limp, and he collapsed onto his side with a faint gasp. Sebastian. Martha dropped beside him, catching his shoulders and pulling him gently against her. Leo clutched his wooden knight with both hands, tears streaming down his face as he cried, "Dad!" Darien had barely begun to move when the corridor changed. The temperature dropped sharply, frost raced across the stone walls, and a crushing pressure swept through the hallway, so powerful that every surviving infiltrator froze in place. The commander had arrived. Chapter 9, Blood and the Clue. Darien groaned, pushing his bruised frame up from the stone floor as frost bloomed rapidly across the hallway walls, crystallizing the pools of spilled blood into jagged red ice. The temperature didn't just drop, it shattered, the air turning so frigid that every breath burned like drawn glass in his lungs. Darien raised his head, his eyes widening in primal terror as he met the burning, apocalyptic crimson glare of the man standing at the threshold. For 200 years, Niklaus had carved out this valley. He had built these stone walls, secured every defense, and sworn that no monster, no chain, and no memory of the iron cage would ever cross his threshold. He had made this home a sanctuary. He had made it for Sebastian so he could breathe without fear, so his son could laugh, and so the tiny fragile lives growing inside his mate could awaken into a world that loved them. And now, a traitor stood inside his home. Niklaus took in the sight of Darien's drawn blade, of Martha on her knees with trembling hands over Sebastian's motionless body, and of Leo weeping against the wall, holding his wooden knight as if it could save him from the dark. He saw the faint golden glow beneath Sebastian's skin, the visible sign of the tremendous strain his mate had endured, leaving him breathless and cold on the floor. There was no commander left inside Niklaus in that moment. There was no strategic mind, no honor, and no mercy. There was only the beast, and it demanded retribution for every tear his son had shed, every drop of sweat on Sebastian's brow, and every breath Darien dared to draw inside his home. The pressure in the corridor expanded until the overhead glass lamps shattered into fine dust. Darien tried to scramble backward, lifting his sword in a desperate defensive guard, but Niklaus moved like an avalanche, closing the distance in a blur of terrifying Enigma speed. Before Darien could swing, Niklaus's massive clawed hand clamped around the traitor's throat, shattering his neck armor and lifting his full body off the floor like a rag doll before slamming him into the stone wall hard enough to crack the foundation. "You brought his shadow into my house," Niklaus growled, his voice a horrifying, distorted roar that vibrated through the floorboards. "You laid eyes on my mate. You pointed a blade at my son." Darien clawed frantically at Niklaus's iron wrist, his feet dangling uselessly in the air as his airway closed completely, choked pleas dying in his throat as frost crept up his skin. Niklaus's eyes flared blindingly bright as he pulled Darien forward and drove him into the ground, pinning him under a knee with crushing force. He raised his fist, Enigma strength surging through his arm, ready to end the traitor where he lay. "Niklaus." Martha's sharp, commanding voice cut through the sound of the struggle. Niklaus froze, his fist hovering inches from Darian's battered face. "Look at him," Martha ordered, her voice firm despite her tears as she pointed down at Sebastian while Leo clung to her skirt. "He is breathing but he is weak. If you turn into a monster in front of your son right now, the alchemist wins anyway." Niklaus's chest heaved as the wild rage clashed against the sound of Martha's voice. His gaze slowly shifted from the bleeding traitor beneath his knee to the corner of the room, fixing on Leo staring at him with wide, frightened eyes, and then on Sebastian lying pale against the floor, his chest rising in shallow, painful beats. The killing instinct vanished in an instant. Hauling Darian up by the collar, Niklaus hurled his broken body down the hall into the arms of Cassian, who had finally stumbled into the master wing, bleeding and breathless. "Put him in the deepest cell," Niklaus commanded, his voice cold as death. "Keep him alive. Gideon will get the answers we need." Cassian dragged the traitor away without a word, leaving the master wing in silence once more. Niklaus dropped to his knees beside Sebastian, his large hands trembling as he gently gathered his pale mate into his arms, pulling him tightly against his chest while Martha wrapped a heavy blanket around them both and Leo buried his face into Niklaus's side. Later that evening, down in the holding vaults, Gideon examined the alchemical mark on Darian's skin. His expression hardened as the scanner detected a faint transmission coming from the mark. It wasn't just an identification mark, it was a tracking device. Someone had been using it to monitor Darian from a distance. Gideon traced the signal back to the old mountain basin, directly beneath the ruins of Niklaus's original laboratory. Niklaus stared at him in silence. "The original laboratory," he whispered. "He never left the place where he made me. He built his sanctuary in the grave of my childhood." Niklaus's eyes narrowed into crimson slits as the truth settled over him. "The original laboratory," Niklaus whispered as the dark memory washed over him. "He never left the place where he made me. He built his sanctuary in the grave of my childhood." Martha stepped up beside Niklaus in the dim light of the vault, placing a gentle hand on her son's arm. "He wants you to come back to the iron, Niklaus. He wants you terrified." Niklaus looked down at Martha, then back at the illuminated map on Gideon's terminal, his expression hardening into pure, unbreakable iron. "He thinks I am the boy who bled in his cage. He doesn't know that I am coming back to burn his world to ashes." Chapter 10, Back to the Iron. The smell reached me before I saw the entrance. Iron, cold stone, copper. For generations I believed I had escaped this place. I was wrong. I had only escaped its walls. Niklaus stood before the shattered rock face of the mountain, staring into the gaping black mouth of the cavern. Cold air poured out from the depths, carrying with it the sickeningly familiar stench of dried blood, sulfur and alchemical preservatives. Behind him, Cassian leaned heavily on his sword, his face pale from his untreated wounds, while Gideon made final adjustments to a mechanical lock breaker, its gears clicking quietly into place. The protectors formed a tight perimeter around the entrance, their weapons drawn, every eye fixed on their commander. Cassian spat blood onto the snow and looked up into the darkness. "Are we ready?" Niklaus didn't blink, his crimson eyes burning steady and deadly. "No. But we're going anyway." They descended into the belly of the mountain, the heavy thud of their boots echoing down winding, damp tunnels lined with rusted iron pipes. The deeper they went, the heavier the oppressive air became, thick with the lingering chemical stench of old experiments. The corridors had not changed, the faded bloodstains on the flagstones, the deep claw marks etched into the iron doors, and the faint, terrible echoes of his own past remained. Memories rose like specters around Niklaus, a frightened, starving 7-year-old boy huddled in the dark, the freezing bite of iron shackles, the thick glass needles piercing his flesh, and the pale, methodical eyes of the monster who had torn him apart to see how he worked. When they broke through the reinforced inner doors, they entered a sprawling, multi-tiered chamber bathed in the sickly green glow of pressurized chemical vats. Row upon row of thick glass cylinders filled the space, suspended within brass scaffolding, while ancient leather-bound ledgers and surgical tools lay stacked across heavy wooden work tables. At the center of the upper gallery, standing before a towering array of glowing brass mechanisms and copper tubing, the alchemist was waiting. He turned slowly, brushing dust from his formal coat. He looked older, his skin stretched thin over his skull, but his eyes burned with the exact same cold, clinical fascination that had haunted Niklaus's nightmares for lifetimes. "Look at you," the alchemist murmured, marveling. "The vessel held together after all." Niklaus said nothing, unsheathing his blade with a clear, metallic ring. The alchemist offered a grotesque, hollow smile. My finest creation has proven fertile. The bloodline grows into a double yield. Niklaus's jaw tightened until the bone threatened to crack. Those are my children. The alchemist merely tilted his head, dismissing the words. They are specimens. Evolutionary milestones. You were merely the prototype. Before Niklaus could step forward, the alchemist slammed a heavy mechanical lever into the central pedestal. Gear-driven iron grates crashed down from the ceiling with a deafening screech, trapping Cassian and Gideon behind thick, reinforced bars. Pressure valves hissed open all around the gallery, and a dense, heavy black vapor poured from vents along the walls, filling the chamber instantly with the bitter chemical stench of sulfur, copper, and medicinal agents. Niklaus lunged toward the platform, but the moment he inhaled the mist, his muscles locked. His vision blurred violently, his legs grew leaden, and his balance faltered. The blood-derived suppressant flooded his nervous system, stripping away his Enigma strength and leaving him staggering, leaning heavily against his sword just to remain upright. The alchemist watched him struggle with soft, fond amusement as Niklaus gasped for air against the paralyzing chemical weight. "Do you really think I spent 2 centuries sitting in darkness doing nothing?" the alchemist asked, his voice echoing over the hiss of the vents. "Your blood was the finest specimen I have ever studied. Every sample you gave me, every reaction, every change in your physiology, I recorded everything. I refined the compounds. I tested them. I perfected them." He gestured toward the laboratory around them while Niklaus fought just to keep his knees from buckling. Suppressants that can bring an Enigma to his knees. Compounds that can dull your senses, weaken your healing, and make your own mind turn against you. Hallucinogens calibrated to your memories. Neurochemical agents capable of triggering fear, confusion, even obedience. He gave a quiet chuckle. All of it came from one extraordinary specimen. Niklaus's eyes burned crimson through the fog, his fingers raw as he gripped the hilt of his blade. The alchemist's gaze shifted toward him with naked, feverish fascination. "And now that specimen has reproduced, do you have any idea what that means, Niklaus? 2 new subjects carrying your bloodline. 2 opportunities to discover what your body can become after generations of refinement. I spent centuries learning what one extraordinary enigma could do. Imagine what I could achieve with 3. They are not your subjects," Niklaus rasped, every word an agonizing effort as the mind-altering compounds clawed at his thoughts, threatening to drag him into a wave of traumatic hallucinations. "Everything you are belongs to the work I began," the alchemist replied, stepping closer. "No," Niklaus whispered, fighting through the chemical haze. "Everything I am belongs to me." As the compound forced Niklaus to his knees and tried to drown him in old nightmares of his childhood cell, a memory broke through the haze, not magic but the stubborn reality of his life. He remembered Martha's hand through the iron bars of his youth, telling him that one day someone would see the man before the beast. He remembered Sebastian's warm, steady touch, and the promise he had made to return home to his family. The alchemist had built this compound from Niklaus's blood and trauma, but he had never understood what gave Niklaus a reason to live. With every muscle screaming against the chemical suppression, Niklaus forced himself upright, dragging his weight away from the densest pocket of the vapor to clear his lungs with a harsh intake of cleaner air. The alchemist gasped in shock as Niklaus broke out of the fog. The battle that followed was brutal, fast, and mechanical. The alchemist pulled secondary levers, activating massive steam-driven iron automatons and hurling glass vials of volatile, corrosive fluids across the hall. Behind the grate, Gideon worked frantically, jamming a heavy steel wedge into the lock mechanism and triggering a pressurized breach charge that blew the gate off its hinges. Cassian threw himself into the fray despite his injuries, drawing his blade to intercept a volley of poisoned alchemical darts meant for Niklaus's back. Taking a deep blade slash across his shoulder, Cassian held the line while Gideon began smashing the pressurized chemical supply tanks. Meanwhile, Niklaus drove the alchemist backward, step by grueling step. The old man drew a needle-thin, serum-coated blade and drove it deep into Niklaus's side. Niklaus didn't even flinch. He grabbed the steel with his bare hand, snapped it in half, and disarmed his creator with a bone-crushing strike to the arm. The alchemist crashed hard against the central control pedestal, coughing dark blood as the mechanical framework of his laboratory rattled and broke under the destruction of the supply lines. "You can't destroy my legacy," the old man wheezed, clutching his broken arm, eyes wide with horror as pressure gauges spiked into the red. "It's 200 years of science." "My legacy is at home," Niklaus said coldly. He brought his heavy broadsword down with all his force into the main pressure core and the electrical generator housing. Spouts of volatile chemical fire flared out immediately, igniting the residual gases in the room and triggering a chain reaction of structural explosions through the mountain's support pillars. As the stone ceiling cracked and began to cave in, Cassian stumbled over the rubble. Niklaus caught his lieutenant's arm before he could fall, hauling him toward the exit. "You're going straight to Valeria when we get back," Niklaus barked over the roar of collapsing rock. Cassian gave a weak, bloody grin. "Are you going to say thank you?" "Don't ruin the moment," Niklaus muttered. At the threshold of the outer corridor, Niklaus paused for a single second. He looked back at the shattered iron cell where his life had been stolen so many years ago. It was buried now under falling stone and chemical fire. He turned his back on it forever. The protectors dragged themselves clear just as the entire inner facility caved in under millions of tons of solid rock, sealing the alchemist and his work in the dark forever. Walking out into the crisp, cold mountain air, supported on either side by Cassian and Gideon, Niklaus looked down toward the valley path. A tired, bleeding man, who was finally going home. Chapter 11, The Last Price. The heavy iron doors of the estate swung open to a bitter, howling wind, but inside, the master wing was suffused with a heavy, suffocating silence. Niklaus limped through the threshold, supported heavily by Cassian and Gideon, his armor battered and stained with drying blood. Martha was at his side before his boots could track dirt onto the floorboards, her warm, lined face etched with a mix of fierce maternal relief and grave urgency. She didn't waste time on scolding. She simply took a clean cloth, pressed it against the gashed side of his abdomen, and looked into his tired crimson eyes. She told him that Sebastian had taken a sudden turn for the worse, that the prolonged pheromone release days prior had left his body dangerously depleted, and the physical stress of the last several days had pushed him far beyond the limits of what Valeria believed his fragile frame could endure. Niklaus dismissed his guards with a ragged wave, ignoring the stinging pain in his side as he pushed through the inner chamber doors. Sebastian lay beneath a mound of heavy furs, his face deathly pale, his forehead glistening with a cold sweat. His hands were locked tightly over the prominent rise of his stomach, gasping softly with every shallow breath. Standing at the foot of the bed, Valeria wiped her hands on a crimson towel, her dark eyes solemn as she checked his rapid, thready pulse. When Sebastian heard the faint clinking of Niklaus's broken armor, his eyes fluttered open. A faint, breathtaking smile touched his dry lips, and he weakly stretched out a trembling hand. Niklaus dropped to his knees at the bedside, taking his mate's hand in his broad, clawed palm, pressing a desperate, reverent kiss against his knuckles as he whispered that the monster was dead and the cage was buried forever. The respite was fleeting. Before Sebastian could speak, a sharp, terrible gasp tore from his throat as his whole body seized. Valeria moved with swift, clinical precision, pulling back the linens. The labor had begun. Whether it was the strain, the lingering physical exhaustion, or simply Sebastian's body reaching its absolute limit, Valeria didn't know. What she knew was that he was dangerously weak. 4 grueling hours that blurred into an agonizing nightmare, the sick room became a battleground for survival. Down in the far doorway, Leo clung to Martha's apron, clutching his wooden knight, praying in silent tears as his father's pained cries echoed off the stone walls. Niklaus never let go of Sebastian's hand, letting Sebastian draw strength from his steady presence while Sebastian poured every remaining ounce of strength he had left into bringing their children into the world. Just as the storm outside reached its absolute peak, the unbearable tension shattered. A loud, clear, squalling cry broke through the room, followed immediately by a second, softer wail. Valeria wrapped the 2 tiny infants in soft wool, her face softening into a weary smile as she announced the birth of a boy and a girl. Martha immediately gathered the crying infants to clean them and bring them toward Leo, who stared down at his new brother and sister with wide, wonder-filled eyes. But the triumph in the room vanished in a heartbeat. The last faint traces of golden light beneath Sebastian's skin, a subtle marker of the pregnancy, faded completely with the twins' birth, disappearing as their cries filled the room. Then Sebastian's hand went limp in Niklaus's grasp. His chest gave a hollow, devastating rattle before going unnaturally still. Valeria checked his fading vital signs, her hands beginning to tremble as her face fell into terrible, crushing resignation. She stepped back, her voice barely a whisper as she looked up at the commander and confessed that Sebastian's heart had given out under the physical strain. His exhausted body was shutting down. A jagged, soundless horror tore through Niklaus's chest before exploding out of him in a desperate, thunderous roar. "No, Sebastian." The commander's voice, usually an unyielding iron pillar, cracked into a shattered, sobbing cry that shook the room. He gathered Sebastian's limp, cooling frame into his massive arms, pulling him against his chest with a fierce, terrified strength, burying his face into the hollow of Sebastian's neck. "Look at me. Open your eyes. You cannot leave me. I buried the cage. I built this home for you." Tears spilled freely over Sebastian's pale cheeks. Deep inside his chest, his breath stuttered. He was so tired. The cold had reached deep into his limbs, his body heavy and distant, every breath becoming harder than the last. Letting go would have been easier. Closing his eyes would have been easier. But he wasn't ready. Not when he could hear Leo's small, frantic sobs from the doorway. Not when the faint, fragile cries of his newborn twins still filled the room. Not when he had an entire lifetime of peace left to build in the sanctuary they had bled to defend. With a monumental effort that defied his failing body, Sebastian's hand twitched, his fingers weakly dragging up the battered leather of Niklaus's chest until they brushed against the hot, beating pulse point on the commander's neck. His dim eyes fluttered open, locking onto Niklaus's crimson gaze with a desperate clarity. "I'm not leaving our home," Sebastian choked out, his voice a feather-soft, heartbreaking rasp. "I want forever with you, Niklaus. Save me, give me your blood. Make me stay." Niklaus didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. The terrifying agony in his chest gave way to an absolute, unyielding resolve. Baring his fangs, he slammed his wrist against his teeth, slicing the skin open, and pressed the dark, hot stream of his immortal blood directly against Sebastian's parted lips. Sebastian swallowed weakly at first, then with a sudden instinctual hunger as the ancient blood flooded his gasping throat and poured into his dying veins. His mortal heart gave one final decisive stop, and then restarted with a thunderous, resonant beat that rattled through his frame. For 24 agonizing hours, Sebastian remained caught between the mortality he was leaving behind and the immortal life he had chosen. His body burned as the Enigma blood remade him from the inside out, forcing every part of him to adapt to the immortal blood while Valeria could only monitor and wait through the change. His heartbeat grew steadily stronger and heavier, each slow beat proof that he was fighting his way back. During those endless hours, Niklaus was a man unraveled. He became a phantom haunting the master wing, incapable of sitting still or leaving Sebastian's side for more than a few seconds at a time. The violent tension radiating from his frame made him pace the hearth like a caged beast, his breathing ragged, his hand repeatedly hovering over Sebastian's pulse as if checking to ensure his mate hadn't slipped away. Whenever Valeria or Martha stepped close to adjust the linens, Niklaus's crimson eyes would flash with a primal protective threat before his rational mind caught up, forcing him to step back and bury his face in his hands, trembling from sheer emotional exhaustion. Outside the sick room, the estate remained on maximum alert. Cassian, despite his heavy bandages, posted himself at the top of the central staircase alongside Gideon. The two maintained a silent, unyielding vigil, ensuring the perimeter remained impenetrable so the commander and his mate could endure the transition in absolute safety. Down in the nursery, Martha took total command. With gentle, practiced hands, she cared for the newborn twins, feeding them, wrapping them in warm wool, and keeping them settled alongside Leo. The young boy sat on the rug by the nursery fire, holding his wooden knight tightly, listening to Martha's calm, steady voice as she assured him that his father was merely resting after a very long fight. As the 24th hour drew to a close, the frantic tension in the bedroom shattered. Sebastian's eyes opened, a clear, luminous crimson light burning within them. Niklaus was beside him in a heartbeat. "Sebastian." Before Niklaus could finish, Sebastian reached up with startling, supernatural speed. His hands locked around Niklaus's shoulders, pulling the massive commander down. Driven by pure, instinctual drive, Sebastian buried his face against the side of Niklaus's neck, finding the open vein and drinking deeply. The exchange was raw, intense, and deeply intimate, a physical seal binding their bodies and completing the final stage of his transformation. The burning hunger subsided into a rich, deep warmth that settled through Sebastian's limbs. Slowly, his fangs retracted and he pulled back, his mouth stained red, his breathing steady and strong. Niklaus stared down at him, his own eyes wide with awe, relief, and profound devotion. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a drop of crimson from Sebastian's lip. "You're here," Niklaus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sebastian looked up at him, fully awake, fully whole, and completely free of the fragile mortality that had threatened to tear them apart. Without a word, he pulled Niklaus down into a deep kiss, a solemn vow sealed in blood and survival. He closed his eyes against Niklaus's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of cedar and snow, his hands resting solidly over the commander's back. "I'm home. Epilogue, only forever. A full year had passed since the snows washed away the remnants of the mountain fortress, and spring had returned to the valley in a vibrant burst of wild blossoms and soft mountain sunlight. The heavy estate, once a cold fortress built for war and defense, was now alive with warmth, open doors, and the rhythmic sound of life thriving. Sunlight poured through the grand bay windows of the master wing, illuminating polished wood floors and catching the golden threads woven into the tapestries hanging along the stone halls. Out on the sunlit courtyard terrace, 7-year-old Leo was practically flying across the flagstones, wooden sword raised high, his laughter echoing against the mountainside as Cassian chased him with exaggerated steps, pretending to be utterly outmatched by the young knight's clever swordplay. Nearby on the wooden bench, Gideon rested against the stone wall, a serene smile on his face as he lazily twirled a soft spell in his palm, conjuring tiny, harmless sparks of light for Leo to chase. The estate was secure, the valley was at peace, and the dark shadow of the alchemist had finally become nothing more than a buried memory beneath millions of tons of stone. Inside the nursery, Martha rocked gently in her wooden armchair, folding tiny woolen sweaters while keeping a watchful eye on the dual cribs near the hearth. The twins, now robust and brimming with health, were crawling across the thick plush rug. Lucas, with his father's dark, wild curls and striking crimson eyes, was busy attempting to stack wooden blocks, while his sister, Aurelia, whose bright golden eyes sparkled whenever she giggled, was determinedly chasing a sunbeam across the floorboards. They were healthy, vibrant, and completely safe, growing under the unconditional protection of a family that had fought through hell to claim this peace. On the eastern balcony overlooking the sprawling valley, Niklaus stood with his arms loosely wrapped around Sebastian's waist, pulling his mate close against his chest. Sebastian rested his head back against Niklaus's shoulder, his skin radiant with supernatural warmth, his crimson eyes gleaming with quiet contentment as he took in the breathtaking view of their domain. He was no longer fragile, no longer bound by the ticking clock of mortality or the physical scars left by the alchemist. He was whole, powerful, and utterly grounded in the home they had built together. Niklaus leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss against the side of Sebastian's neck, right over the pulse point where Sebastian's immortal heart beat steadily beneath his skin. For generations, Niklaus had lived as a creature defined by survival, vengeance, and the cold metal of his cage. But as he felt the strong beat matching his own, heard Leo's joyous shouts from the courtyard below, and felt the quiet warmth of his family surrounding him, the last traces of the old darkness evaporated into the crisp morning air. He was no longer a weapon or a ghost of the past. He was a husband, a father, and a guardian of a love that would outlast the mountains themselves. Thinking about the past? Sebastian whispered softly, turning slightly in Niklaus's arms to look up into those deep crimson eyes that now held only warmth. Niklaus smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached all the way to his soul, and tightened his embrace, resting his forehead gently against Sebastian's. "No," Niklaus murmured softly into the sunlight. "Only forever."